Go for it.
Okay, so my presentation is about early shoe factories in Raymond. And learning about Raymond, a lot of things follow with the shoe factories coming to Raymond. And it was the railroad coming through Raymond in the 1850s, which allowed this sort of cottage industry to really gravitate so that we had more than just the regular shoe shops on every farm. Does anybody recognize that picture on the bottom? Yeah. So that was a shoe shop that Willie B. Green worked in. And if you can't really see those maps on the lower left, but there's an excellent map from 1857 and from 1892 that shows every dwelling in Raymond and who owned it. And then there's, along with that, shoe shops, blacksmith shops, other little things like that. And it seems like on every road there's a shoe shop. And it would have been typical that farmers would have added that kind of business so that they got a little bit of income they could purchase beyond what they were just raising. So they would often build something right next to the farm, and it would maybe just be a 10 by 10 building, and the younger sons, as they grew older, would do shoe work there. And if you look at the occupations in the census records, a cordwainer is what it was referred to early on. But if you look at the census in other towns like Haverhill, there's the Moroccan dresser, and that is like the goat hide from Morocco, and it's a tanning job. So there's all sorts of jobs and occupations that go along with the shoe industry. The two maps on the right are insets to the 1857 map and the 1892 map. And this is the common right here, and this is coming down Main Street toward the railroad tracks. And Joseph and Sherburne Blake had a shoe manufacturer. I really don't know that much about it, but that's very early in 1857. They also had a store, they had a tavern, they owned much of the land that became the village. They came from West Epping. If you ride through the trails behind my house and go into West Epping, that was the main way through to go to Concord from like Newburyport up through Epping, and now it's a dirt road. You feel like you've stepped back 100 years if you go to that neighborhood now. But they had shoe shops there, and the Blakes lived on that farm there, moved to Raymond in about 1800, and started buying parcel after parcel of land. Part of it for the woodlots, part of it so they would divide it and sell it, but most of what is the village was Joseph and Sherburne Blake. And there were Blakes here from 1800 through the mid-1900s.
So where were they getting all the leather? I mean, what?
They, I think, I know, I'm not really sure.
Oh, okay.
According to Steve, it was the shoe manufacturer, shoe places down in Haverhill would ship it up here on wagons and distribute it to the farmers. Then once the railroad came in, they started building the factories up here instead of shipping all the stuff individually and parsing it out to the farmers.
With Manchester turned out to be a very large producer of treated leather. I did a lot of testing of the lungs of the folks that worked in that area of when the leather was being vulcanized, it was softened through the procedure. They all ended up with lung problems. That's my knowledge of shoe factories, especially in Manchester, BB Shoe.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, in Haverhill, those industrial towns that were near rivers at the time, and then near railroads. And that's exactly right. I had read stuff like that too. They would assemble the shoes at these little shoe shops. Cobbler put it together, and it wasn't until they had the shoe factories where there was more of a, you would have the last, and we have some in the cabinets back there, the wooden form, so they would have different sizes. People would have individual jobs to go with the shoe factory. And then a couple other on here. This is the 1892 map, so we've had the railroad for 40 years. Look how many more houses are in the village. And then 2 shoe factories are built by now. There's one over on what is White Street now. These are hard to read from there. Where White Street, where you come from Old Manchester Road.
Yes.
This is Old Manchester coming toward the village. It would have been two-way at the time, and I don't know what it was when you guys moved to town, but now it connects over to White Street just one way here. So the shoe factory was strategically located right next to the railroad so that they could get their products out and get the materials that they needed in. And at the time in this picture, it's owned by Brown. So you see the Brown SS. And if you look at these other maps, that's what you'd be looking for if you're glancing through all of the, the dwellings. If there's a SS, that means there's a shoe shop there. A BS would be the blacksmith shop. There'd be carriage shops. We did have one early tanner in town, a Benjamin Cram, who lived in the downtown area. I don't know that much about him either, but we did have some local tanning. And then the other shoe factory is, of course, the one that we all know about, the Hoyt Shoe Factory on the other side of the railroad tracks. So here's the depot, and at this point in 1892, it's on the other side of the railroad tracks, and that's probably what most people are familiar with. One other thing, oh good, is on the corner of Floral Ave here, there's something called a carriage shop, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. This is a picture from Matthew Thomas's book about Rockingham County, and it's an 1874 photo of Ladd's Shoe Shop. I would have known nothing about this, but this is that house on Floral Ave. You'll see it on the next slide.
The beehive?
Yeah, the beehive, exactly. And in Fullerton's book, he wrote a lot of poems in his book, or nice little things. And he has a stanza there. Ladd has a shoe factory, workmen busy as bees, ironically. Jones has a livery stable, you can ride when you please. So that was in the village, and this is 1874, how he's describing it. He has another poem for what the town was like when we were settled in 1764 in the first town meeting, and that's a photograph of that house. And as Sally says, I think Sally's the one who told me, Sally or Paul, that it was referred to as the beehive, I think because it was a very busy, large apartment building. But the Ladds did not actually own this building, but they own two houses, but in the area that goes from the common toward where it says the carriage shop, that's where the Ladds lived. And there was a brother named John Ladd who was a blacksmith, and a brother named Abraham Ladd, and in the census records he's listed as a shoemaker. All right, I apologize.
I never knew that I never saw that picture.
I know.
I have that book.
I know. Go back and look. It's, yep.
I have to look at all of them more carefully.
I know so many things. Once I learn something else, then I go back to it and I'm like, aha, this makes so much more sense now. All right, so here's a side-by-side picture. I'm not sure that's convincing, but Matthew assured me it is. And then this picture on the lower right is after the flood in 1900. So you see that large building with very little around it. It would have gone right down to the river there. Well, the river came right up to it at that point. And the Ladds were related to the Beans. So David Bean, oh, my pointer's gone again. But if you see Abraham Ladd is in that second column, his father was John. His wife's father was Abraham Bean, who was the son of David Bean, which was the brother of Benjamin Bean. And David Bean is the one that moved on to Candia. Yeah. He was originally in Raymond, according to Fullerton. I'm not sure how long he lived here, but that was about 1750 when the Beans came. Now, this just shows a few plans that are with the Registry of Deeds for the land around this depot. And I show you this. It's kind of out of order here, but if you read the deed at the very bottom, it talks about also on this property is an ice house and a shoe shop and a stable situated on disputed territory. Now the land in that area, and it's the area where Horseshed Row goes between the Pilgrim Inn and the Congregational Church, it was at one time a shoe factory. I'll show you the picture. And then it was eventually Andrew Gordon coming into the early 1900s. It was owned by the town of Raymond. It was going to be the Raymond Manufacturing. This is kind of hard for you guys to see, I guess, but this is a wonderful bird's eye view of our village. We're so lucky to have this, and it's because we were kind of a busy and growing town after the 1850s. So these were very commonly done for New England towns in the 1880s, and this is, let me turn on my pointer again. This is the common, so you get your lay of the land here, and you see the Congregational Church right here. Right next to it is a factory, and that's the F.M. Hoyt and Company boot and shoe manufacturers. They were originally in that little space there, and this boggles my mind, and then it was moved across the railroad tracks to this location on the opposite side of the depot. So this is 1887. By the time 1892, when we had the Great Fire, the factory was over there, and the factory was actually saved because we did not have water in town. The railroad had offered Raymond water, and they passed on that. And we know how that all turned out. But the shoe factory was smart. They had a bucket brigade, and at any given time they had a number of employees who were responsible. So when they heard and it probably would have been the church bell ringing before the church burned down, people would have got the word, and they came with their buckets, and it was literally bucket to bucket, handing it down. Each individual household had their own bucket so that they could save. In that case, it was the F.M. Hoyt shoe factory. And interestingly enough, F.M. Hoyt, I apologize for this, F.M. Hoyt had already made plans to leave Raymond. He had made plans the year before to move to Manchester. I'm just going to leave it like that, since it keeps. Manchester had enticed F.M. Hoyt with a new factory there. We had enticed Francis M. Hoyt to come to Raymond in the 1880s. He had a shoe shop in Haverhill, and one of their great fire was in 1883. He completely lost his shoe shop, $4,000, and then he moved to Raymond. Raymond citizens, and I really can't track this except I read a news article about it at the time, put in $6,000 to build what would be the Francis M. Hoyt shoe factory. So we enticed him to come here. Within a decade, he's already made plans to go to Manchester because they're going to build him something even bigger. And as we know, then Manchester became the shoe city. Here's a picture in the lower right of what that factory looked like. So if you could get your bearings, you're looking across the common. That's what the first Congregational Church looked like. It was built in 1834. The little building next to it is the vestry. And then that large 3-story building was the shoe factory on that side of the railroad tracks.
How long did they stay here after the fire?
He was already leaving. He was supposed to be in Manchester of July of 1892, and it must have just taken a little bit more time. So Raymond, because of the fire, we then immediately that evening when there's still embers burning, townspeople met, decided that we need a waterworks and we need a fire department. So they got busy on that, and the way that they ran the water pipe was they built the Orchard Water Tower, the standpipe, and they built a water supply coming from the Lamprey. If you go down like the 3rd or 4th house on Epping Street, there's a passageway by Steve McGrath's house that goes down to the Lamprey River, and there was a little brick pump house there. They'd pull the water from the Lamprey up at night, pump it up to the standpipe, and then have it ready for the day. And it was just gravity fed.
But then did somebody else lease that building?
Yes. So Raymond bought the building because we had to run the pump out of that building. And then we enticed Chase Chamberlain to come, and they ran a shoe factory there, and the town owned it. So the town owned it all that time, and I think people might find that very interesting, astonishing. We gave Chase Chamberlain a 5-year lease, and we gave them tax incentives, and they stayed for 5 years. They stayed for another 5 years, and then they had come from South Boston. They actually went back to South Boston and then came back to Raymond again. I think there was always this draw, it's going to be easier. I saw help wanted ads in a country setting, come help wanted at the shoe factory. And, but they always, I think, had trouble getting enough people. The business was probably as fickle as other things, so hard to,
But way back, because I saw it on one of those fire maps, they put in a sprinkler system.
They did.
Back in the 1890s, which I think is amazing.
Yeah. They had a hydrant and they had their bucket brigade, but the town didn't have it, the depot didn't have it. In the first annual report after the fire, there is an extensive report of the waterworks, and it talks all about what horsepower engine they put in, what kind of hydrants they put in, the cost of all of this. And if my screen would come back, I'll show you the Sanborn fire insurance maps that show right before the fire what our town looked like, and then I have one a few years after the fire that shows the hydrants, the standpipe, everything. One other person to mention is a fellow named George Tripp, who in the 1860 census here in Raymond was a shoe manufacturer. He owned that land where that Hoyt was built, so he might be in that deed that I showed you that said there's a shoe shop on disputed territory. I think the railroad owned land going a little in that direction, and that might have been when they were talking about disputed land. George Tripp was a Civil War soldier, and he died from conditions after the Civil War, so he only lived to 1883, I think. But he's in the 1860 census as a shoe manufacturer, and that's 20 years before Hoyt came here. Of course, there was the 1874 one with lead, so we had these smaller shoe shops before the big. Another great source of information for the kind of industry that we had in town are these gazetteers or registers. So, for example, I should have marked where these were, but in the 1871 register, we had William Blake with shoes on the lower left. I hate to get my pointer back and have the whole thing go away. And we have, let's see, in the 1872, manufacturers, this is about halfway down on the right, Boots and Shoes, W.D. Ladd, and then other kinds of industries, which are mostly mills. So a lumber mill, we have Sugar Box and Staves, the Nutter Company, which is over at the outlet of Jones, which became Onway Lake, and then also the Lovering Place, which is the Gordon Place on Route 102. They made tubs, pails, mackerel kits, shingles. So these gazetteers are pretty helpful because they'll tell you who were in charge of different kinds of industries in town. And here's others going later into the early 1900s that list the manufacturers. So on the lower right in the 1904 register, we have shoes, Chasen Chamberlain and L.K. Morse. And at the bottom left, we have Boots and Shoes. This is 1926, so much later. Boots and shoes that are being sold by the Raymond Grain and Grocery Store, also by Albert Elliott and Joseph A. Blake. And then Boots and Shoe Harness Repairs by Harvey and Batchelor. And then Shoemakers by now, Falconer is in town. So the two factories were both Falconer at that point, which I didn't know. One was called Falconer Blood and one was called Falconer Shoe. So I was telling you earlier, these maps are so excellent, the Sanborn fire insurance maps. And for Raymond, these are the ones that I've been able to find. One right before the fire, 1892, one 6 years after the fire, 1898, and then a few in the 1900s. And they show every dwelling in or building in just the village section. So this is in 1892. And the two factories at that time, the one on White Street is the red circle, and that was called Healy and Brown. And that was Dana C. Healy, and I'm not sure which Brown, to be honest. And then by now, the Hoyt shoe factory is on the other side of the railroad tracks, so you can see how it got moved. If you look over to the common, you can see where the Congregational Church is, where my arrow is here, and the horse shed's right next to it. That other building would have been right here, because that's the Pilgrim Inn. And the way these Sanborn fire insurance maps work, there's a legend on them, and they have how many stories the building is, how big it is, what its footprint is, what it's made out of. So this building in pink meant that it was made out of brick. So it was more fireproof. This would help them to determine what the insurance rates would be. So the Hoyt manufacturer here, it is all wood except where the boiler room was on this side, that was made out of brick. And here's,
That would be right over here.
yep, that's the one on the tracks here. And then it also gave information about, so I'm now reading in that blue box at the lower left for the FM Hoyt, a night watchman and watch clock. Talks about power and heat, steam, light, and it says what kind of sprinklers. So there you go, Terry, with what you were reading about it. It had sprinklers. This is before the Great Fire. And it had a supply of fire, what does it say, on every floor, a tank in the tower, and sprinklers. To the next Sanborn fire insurance map. This is in 1898. Both of those shoe factories have different businesses in them now. The one that's on White Street is now being operated by A.P. Brown, and I just know the name is A. Polk Brown, and I couldn't figure out how he's related to any of the Browns in town.
What is it?
It's A.P. and it was Polk in one of the records I saw. So I really couldn't figure it out. It's much smaller, as you see from that picture. Yeah, and then again for the Chase Chamberlain, it gives the detail. But the neat thing to see here, this dashed line is now where the water is coming. And you'll see in the downtown area, these dashed lines coming down Orchard Street. That's where the pipes were laid. Every single, where I'm stopping here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, that is a hydrant. Further along, a hydrant. So all the water was laid down Epping Road, all the way down to White Street, Manchester Road, and up to Floral Ave.
And what year was that?
This is 1898.
Is that 4 railroad tracks?
Yes.
Wow.
I know, isn't that neat? So that's pretty amazing that there were 3 extra tracks besides the one that's going through. On the other side, not so much. So, and then also in the note, which is at the top right corner of this map, I just have it blown up in the middle, it says pump from driven wells to the standpipe, and it says what kind of pumps they are and what the capacity is. So this gives, you know, insurance companies an idea, if they're going to insure buildings here, what kind of fire protection do they have, what kind of buildings do they have, how much should we be charging them for fire insurance. Now this picture, I'm not sure, we probably do have a similar picture here, but this top right one, you can see this is looking across the common, and this is a very nice collage that's down at Torrent Hall, down at the fire station, and it shows after the fire, and you can see the shoe factory is still standing back there. Everything else is wiped out, everything else. I want to tell you, I'll just show you, there's a couple of places that have newspapers that are just freely available now. So Derry's newspapers are all completely archived. So you can find, I found the article about the Great Fire, it goes back to 1880, I think. So these are articles from that time period. You know, here's one at the lower left, and this is 1907. Business at the Chase Chamberlain and Company shoe factories is booming, and the cry is more help wanted. And Harry White, who people might recognize that name, he has a scholarship at the schools now. He was early involved in the schools. He was the superintendent of the Chase Chamberlain Shoe Factory. And he's out in Derry on this particular day in 1907 looking for more help. And then you see an ad for the kind of work that they have. They got to be more involved in the community and have more social events. And then this lower right one I thought was pretty interesting. When A.P. Brown was at the shoe factory where the tannery was, he had a new salesman, and then there was also an article about a burglary there and a burglary that was at Whittier's, and also an article about a union strike, different things that happened over the years. And then just to segue a little bit about what happened to Francis Hoyt, he moved to Manchester. They built, I have a picture on the next screen, so I'll go to this. They built this first building for him. These two buildings still survive, and they're townhouses now. This picture right here shows what it looks like now. This is from a very early photo. They're on the National Historic Register. Can you imagine? He built this, or they built the first building for him, and they built it in 1892. So right at the time we were having the fire and suffering, he's already there. And the land that was owned by the mill companies was all much closer to the center of town, so kind of all up here. And they weren't really willing to sell any land, so the shoe business had to get started in areas outside of the center of Manchester. But when he was there for just 3 years, He was able to double his output. He built this second building, and at their peak, they were, I think that I had that article on the other page. I'll go back to it to remember. But that first building was 220 by 43 feet, and it had 4 stories. It just sounds enormous. And here it said, when he first started, he had 300 employees producing 2,400 pairs of McKay brand shoes. Wow. By the time 3 years went by, he doubled his workforce, up to 1,400 workers producing 9,600 pairs of shoes daily. Isn't that crazy? And then Francis Hoyt, I have a picture of this. This is the house that he lived in, and this still exists. It's at 1799 Elm Street. And it's a funeral home now. It's Lambert. I didn't know anything about this. So he only had one child, a daughter, Luella. She married someone named Hovey Slayton, whose father was Edward Slayton, and they were produce dealers. They both lived in big mansions on Elm Street. So she inherited this house, and she, in his will, got $150,000 when he died in 1903, which is worth like $5 million now. Yeah. Yeah. So, Francis Hoyt certainly went big time after leaving Raymond, but Raymond, those shoe shops, continue to live and grow. So this is an article from 1912, and it talks about when Falconer is in town and the big New Year's Eve party he has for employees. So our little Raymond still continued to grow in the shoe business, but nothing like he did in Manchester. Yes. And then this photo at the lower left, when we did the stuff about Emma Bartlett, there's a writer here in New Hampshire that her blog is called Cow Hampshire. I think Terry might recognize that. And she had a blog. This is her grandfather. He was a driver for F.M. Hoyt. F.M. Hoyt had a yacht. He started the automobile, the AAA of New England. This is in 1903, when this would have been very rare to have an automobile, and that was his driver, her grandfather. I thought that was pretty interesting. Now these are the pictures that we have, and I would encourage, I didn't put a lot of pictures of the workers, but this notebook that's on the table here by Dave has pictures, just a handful of pictures of the workers in the shoe shops. So the one building was, 220 by 40 feet, and it had that very tall tower. So if you're looking at any of the shoe factory pictures, that's how you can kind of tell them apart. The Chase Chamberlain, which was Hoyt before, which had the pump for our waterworks, is the one with this big tower. Yep. So this is an aerial view in 1940, which is kind of neat. So you see the back of the Congregational Church here, and this, and the horse sheds are still there. And there's the Guile School. But then you see how large this shoe factory is.
That's the shoe factory.
That's the shoe factory. So this is 1940. So I just have a few more, but so in 1903, it still is Chase Chamberlain. They had left and come back. I mean, every businessman is trying to make their best decision, but they moved from South Boston to Raymond because we made this sweetheart deal. They leased it for 5 years. They leased it for another 5 years, going up to 1904. And then they moved again and came back. So it's very strange, and then the one that's over on White Street is now called the L.K. Morse Shoe, and they were a slipper factory. I'm not really sure of the...
On Old Manchester.
And then in 1908, so Falconer has come to town, and he has the shoe factory that's on White Street where the tannery was. And the other one, we're still calling it Chase Chamberlain, but they're in and out of that place, and the town owns that building because we're still using it to pump the water. Yeah. And as you can see, more of the buildings in town with the green, it shows different amount of fireproof. So there's some changes that have gone on, and you can see down here at the what is the Chase Chamberlain, you can see where the electric light company is that Fox started. It was probably it was on the 1903 one as well. Then the last Sanborn fire insurance map I have for Raymond is 1924. And by now, that is still Falconer where the tannery was, and also the Chase Chamberlain is owned or it's operated by Falconer and Blood Shoe Factory. Although I have this advertisement in here. When we were selling at auction, the town of Raymond owned that, so this is 1960, and that's what that building would have looked like in 1960. And then there was an article in the paper in around the time of our 250th, and you can see this top left building is up where the Argo is at Epping Street and Route 27, and the Burke, and I don't know much about all these. So those are the sources.
It's not 107? Yeah. That's the only one?
And I'll just say, at our harvest supper, Sally's going to give a presentation with my help about the village walking tour, so just FYI, that will be fun. And Art has put together a nice one that you can access on your computer or your phone as you would want to go see the places in the village as part of the village walking tour. And that